guys, tonight we're going to an unremarkable chunk of frozen rock that somehow became the stage for the politest, most liquor-fueled conflict in history. Imagine trudging across endless white nothingness, frost gnawing at your eyebrows, only to arrive at a lump of land so small and barren it could be mistaken for a seal with a bad hair day. And here's the kicker, you're probably not surviving this. Not because of gunfire or bayonets, but because your soul will freeze in protest at the sheer absurdity of being here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments so we know who's listening from a tropical beach and who's already shivering in sympathy. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about Hans Island is, well, nothing. It's 1.3 square kilometers of naked rock, perched between Greenland, which Denmark claims, and Canada's Ellesmere Island. There are no trees, no animals, no water except ice, just wind so sharp it could slice cheese. And you forgot to bring cheese, yet in 1973, when Denmark and Canada drew their maritime boundary in the Narrow Strait, they couldn't quite agree on who got this glamorous chunk of nothing. The rest of the boundary, fine, easy. But Hans Island sat smack in the middle, stubbornly resisting being on one side or the other like a toddler refusing to choose between parents. You trudge over the icy surface, and in your mind, you can already hear the clink of imaginary bottles. Not yet, though first, there's paperwork. Oh yes, the glorious opening salvo of any great war men in suits staring at maps. In Ottawa, Canadian officials squint over lines drawn on a nautical chart. In Copenhagen, Danish officials sip coffee, probably better coffee, and do the same. Neither side wants to budge. The reason, because giving it away, even a barren rock, might set a precedent that weakens their territorial claims elsewhere. Yes, the strategic value of Hans Island was exactly zero, but the symbolic value was slightly above zero. Verified historical fact. The dispute over Hans Island began as part of the 1973 Canada-Denmark maritime boundary negotiations. They settled everything except this one spot, leaving it in friendly limbo, which is basically the diplomatic equivalent of putting a cake in the office fridge with a note saying, "Don't touch," and waiting for chaos. You look around and you start wondering who Hans even was. Turns out it's named after Hans Hendrik, a 19th century Greenlandic Inuit guide who helped European explorers survive Arctic expeditions. Weird trivia nugget, Hans once survived a shipwreck and a polar bear attack, which makes it all the more hilarious that the rock named after him would be the site of a war fought with alcohol. Historians still argue whether Hans Hendrik would have been honored or just rolled his eyes at the idea. On one hand, he did lead white explorers to glory. On the other hand, he probably wasn't into petty flag swapping and whiskey planting. The cold here plays tricks on your mind. You imagine two diplomats from 1973 standing on the ice, each taking one cautious step toward the island before pretending they forgot their gloves and retreating. Maybe they secretly hoped the place would sink, solving the problem, but no, Hans Island sat there, smug and unmoving, daring someone to take it. And you, in your snow-crusted parka, are starting to get suspicious. Why are your superiors so interested in this? Is there oil gold, a stash of frozen chocolate bars from a lost expedition? Nope, just rock. And so, like all great moments in history, nothing much happens for a few years. Both sides politely ignore the rock, occasionally waving from ships like awkward neighbors who can't remember each other's names. Then, slowly, the seeds of silliness begin to sprout. Someone in the Canadian forces decides it might be funny to actually visit, not to occupy, just to check it out. Maybe plant a flag. The Danish military probably had the same thought around the same time. You don't know it yet, but you are about to witness decades of the friendliest combat ever recorded. The ice under your boots groans, the wind howls, and in the distance you swear you see a tiny flag fluttering too small to tell whose. You trudge closer, thinking maybe it's a warning marker for thin ice. It's not. It's a national flag, stuck into this wind-blasted nothing like a kid staking out their snow fort. And next to it, a bottle, an unopened bottle. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, you take in the emptiness, the absurdity, and the way the sky seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the first ridiculous move in what will become the Whisky War. Somewhere, far away, a Canadian bureaucrat is sharpening his pencil, and a Danish officer is checking the duty-free prices on schnapps. The fuse is lit. It's just a really, really slow fuse. You lean over a table that smells like toner and diplomatic caution, squinting at a nautical chart where the Nary Strait is a smear of blue and boredom. Across from you, more squinters, Copenhagen on one side of the world, Ottawa on the other, but spiritually, you're all in the same fluorescent-lit conference room, calculating lines on water that freezes solid half the year. Someone taps a compass against the paper like it's a loaded weapon. Another clears a throat that's been trained at the academy for precisely this coughing meaningfully over other people's sovereignty. Is that dot an island or a printing defect? A voice asks. It's Hans Island, you say. Though honestly, at this scale, it looks like a mosquito that lost a fight. Verified historical fact to keep things grounded while everyone argues about specs in 1973 Canada and Denmark negotiated a maritime boundary through the Nary Strait. They agreed on basically everything except the ownership of Hans Island. That single omission becomes the tiny hinge on which half a century of polite nonsense will eventually swing. You trace the proposed line with a pencil, and it slides to the east of the dot. The Danes trace it again, and surprise, it scoots to the west. You've never seen geometry act like a cat until now. Everyone talks about equidistance, about base points on Ellesmere Island and Greenland, about low water lines and geodesics. You nod as if the words are digestible. They're not. The only thing you can digest here is the coffee, and even that's staging a rebellion. The weird trivia nugget sneaks onto the table like a party crasher. Some old maps label the rock Hanso Danish, while others say Hans Island English. Same stone, two outfits. It's like arguing whether a penguin is formal because it wears a tuxedo, while the penguin stares back, wondering why you think clothes are real. A junior cartographer wheels in a device the size of a typewriter that goes ding when it feels important. New coordinates. They announce. Like a weather report, the senior negotiators nod. You pretend to understand. The device spits out numbers that would put the midline one hair, this way or that. And suddenly, nations flex. This is the peculiar magic of boundary making. Move a decimal, and you've invented a crisis that needs canapes. Surely we can just split the difference. Someone suggests. Surely we can't. A Danish official replies, sipping coffee as if the refusal is a small pastry. If we concede here, we undermine other Arctic claims. The Canadians counter with a smile that has been ironed in Ottawa. Likewise for us, precedent matters. You can almost hear the wind of Hans Island howling through the windows of this room, asking how it got invited to a party with ties. The rock gives no resources, no shelter, no secret missile silo, but it does offer symbolism. And symbols are what humans grab when facts are uncooperative. You scrawl in your notebook, we're arguing about the right to put a flag in a place, the wind will eat the flag. You don't show the notebook to anyone because you like your job. Historians still argue whether the negotiators intentionally left the status of Hans Island unresolved, a face-saving pause button, or whether the ambiguity was simply a practical, we'll get to it later, that kept getting snowed in. One camp says it was deft diplomacy to keep the main treaty moving. Another insists it was the cartographic equivalent of forgetting your lunch in the office fridge and hoping it resolves itself by evaporation. The files never break character, they just sit there, classified and serene, while experts debate in journals with stern fonts. Someone flicks the map with a fingernail. You know, they say, there's an Inuit guide this place is named after, Hans Hendrik. A brief, respectful silence, then back to lines. You try a joke to lighten the air. If both sides are equidistantly annoyed, maybe that's fairness. A senior lawyer looks over the rim of their glasses. International law prefers clarity. Right, you say, clarity, my mistake, obviously. 3 light jokes sneak into your delivery because you're coping first. the equidistantly annoyed thing. Second, the coffee, clearly in violation of the Geneva Conventions against cruel and unusual beverages. Third, the protractor on the table, which in this room feels like a weapons system with a 360-degree firing arc. You imagine stepping out of the meeting and onto the island itself. The snow squeaks under your boots the way it only does when temperatures dive so low that vowels freeze. You plant a mittened hand on a rock and declare, in the privacy of your brain, this is mine. Then you picture a Danish patrol doing the exact same thing 3 weeks later, in the exact same spot, replacing your hypothetical flag with theirs. And you can't help it, you giggle. It's not that sovereignty isn't serious, it's that here, sovereignty is a door you and your neighbor keep locking from opposite sides. An aide reads aloud a clause from the draft treaty. It's soothing, like a lullaby composed by paperwork. The boundary shall follow the median line between the coasts of Greenland and Ellesmere Island, except where otherwise agreed. There's a cough at except, because everyone can see the tiny island balancing on that word like a circus seal. You doodle a tiny seal in your margins. It looks smug, which feels right. The day stretches. If meetings had weather, this one would be a light freezing drizzle, never dramatic, always damp. You circle back to the basic reality if either side takes Hans Island in the final text. The other side has to explain to their parliament why they let it go. Politicians do not enjoy explaining why they gave up even a teaspoon of sand. And so the practical solution becomes a diplomatic non-solution. Finalize the big boundary now. Bracket the pebble for later. Everyone nods. No one wants to be the person whose career is remembered as the Hans Island surrenderer, which sounds like a yacht that never leaves the dock. At lunch, the Canadians joke about naming it Not Worth It Island. The Danes counter with absolutely worth it if you're Danish Island. You keep your mouth shut because you can see how quickly a joke becomes an archive statement. Instead, you ask about the weather in Greenland and get a lecture on katabatic winds that feels like being chased downhill by air. Back at the table, the map stares up with the blank patience of granite. You realize maps are just mirrors that reflect human stubbornness in blue and beige. If aliens landed now and asked what you're doing, you'd say, deciding which flag gets to flap on a rock no one can live on. And they'd nod politely before leaving the planet forever. A Canadian delegate leans over. Look, they whisper, we don't need to win. We just need to not lose. A Danish counterpart whispers back across a different ocean. Exactly our position. You jot victory condition, avoid humiliation. It's amazingly universal. There's a brief, tantalizing moment where someone proposes a joint use approach, shared scientific station. Maybe everyone likes the sound of joint, no one likes the details of use. Budgets float into the conversation and pass out immediately. You can practically hear them snoring under the table. Then the lawyers arrive with a neat diplomatic bow. The treaty can proceed. The island can remain unassigned, and both sides can continue to claim it without actually doing anything rash. You sign where they tell you, somewhere. A rubber stamp thunks down like a judge's gavel. The room exhales. You've created peace by creating a puzzle. Honestly, not a bad day at work. When you finally step outside, the world feels too big for all the tiny lines you've drawn. You imagine Hans Island again, the wind, the ice, the silence. You imagine a future patrol, maybe yours, landing there with a little national flag and a sense of mischief. Maybe someone leaves a bottle as a calling card, because humans love rituals even more than they love maps. You don't know it yet, but that silly idea will ferment into tradition. Duke Roy, you mutter to yourself, pockets stuffed with coordinates. Let the rock be a rock, for now. In the distance of your mind, a cork pops. It's pretend, but it's prophetic. The sky over Hans Island is a blinding sheet of white, and you're standing on the deck of a Canadian Coast Guard vessel wondering how you got volunteered for this. It's 1984, and someone back in Ottawa decided the time was ripe to make a gentle statement of sovereignty. In military terms, that usually means tanks. In Canadian terms, it means flags and a bottle of whiskey. Your boots clomp on the ice as you disembark. The wind immediately starts critiquing your fashion choices, whistling through every seam in your parka. You squint toward the rock you rock today and start the world's least urgent march to shore beside you. A fellow officer hefts a small wooden pole and says, "Don't drop the flag in the snow. The photo op's in 20 minutes. You nod like you're about to raise the colors on Iwo Jima. But really, it feels more like planting a toothpick in a giant snow cone. Verified historical fact. In 1984, Canadian troops, actually more like a patrol team, landed on Hans Island, planted a Canadian flag, and left behind a bottle of Canadian whiskey. No shots, no threats, just here's our flag, and by the way, have a drink. You jab the flagpole into a crevice and hear the satisfying thunk of wood meeting stubborn granite. The maple leaf flaps proudly. Though the wind instantly tries to rip it into confetti, a camera clicks. Somewhere, a public affairs officer is already imagining the headline, "Canada reaffirms sovereignty over Arctic Island." It sounds bold, but here you are, half frozen, half laughing, and entirely aware that the only thing you're occupying is a very small piece of empty space. Weird trivia nugget. That first whiskey bottle was reportedly Canadian Club, chosen not for its quality, but because it was conveniently on hand. Imagine history turning on whatever liquor the quartermaster could grab from the storeroom. If it had been maple syrup, maybe this would be called the Pancake War. Historians still argue whether this first flag and whiskey stunt was pre-planned as a cheeky gesture or simply the result of a bored patrol leader thinking, well, we can't leave it empty-handed. One camp says it was subtle diplomacy with a wink. Another calls it an improvised prank that snowballed into tradition. The truth, probably a little of both. Smile, the photographer yells, which is cruel in sub-zero weather. Your teeth feel like they might shatter into ice cubes, but you grin anyway, holding the bottle like a torch of inebriated liberty. Someone jokes, this is how empires are built, and you almost trip over your own laughter. You take a moment to look around. The island doesn't have so much as a shrub. It's just rocks, snow, and the unending drone of Arctic wind. You're standing on international headline material, and it's the most boring piece of real estate you've ever seen. The absurdity hits you like a slap from a drunk penguin if penguins live this far north, which they don't, because even penguins have standards. Back on the ship, you watch the island shrink into the distance. You imagine the Danes seeing the photos in a newspaper somewhere, frowning into their schnapps. They won't take this lying down. Oh no, if Canadians can bring whiskey, the Danes can bring something equally spirited. This, you realize, is how you've just signed up for decades of polite escalation. 3 jokes keep you warm on the trip back. You've just committed an act of war that could fit in a gift basket. Your national defense contribution today could be poured into a single glass. Somewhere, a customs form is trying to figure out if this counts as an import or a diplomatic offering. The bottle sits in the snow, its label already frosting over, a beacon for the next visitors. You can almost hear it whisper, "Pass me on." The island is a relay race now, and the baton is 750 milliliters of international friendship disguised as competition. When you reach port, there's no parade, no ticker tape, just a few curious reporters asking why the military was handing out booze on a disputed island. You shrug, say something about Canadian hospitality, and leave it at that. In your heart, you know the Danes will be back, and when they come, they won't just take the flag down. They'll bring their own bottle, and the dance will begin. A week later, word filters in a Danish patrol is scheduled to head north. The map in your briefing room has a tiny red pin stuck in Hans Island, and someone's drawn a doodle of a whiskey bottle next to it. That's how you know this isn't a normal border dispute. It's already folklore in the making. In some far-off Copenhagen office, a Danish officer is probably staring at the same dot on a different map, muttering, "Fine, let's see their whiskey and raise them schnapps." The island waits, indifferent. The wind keeps blowing, and somewhere under the flag you planted, a Canadian Club bottle is slowly becoming history's weirdest peace offering. The Danish ship cuts through the Arctic water like a butter knife through, well, Frozen butter, which is basically a chisel. It's a few weeks after the Canadians' little stunt. And Copenhagen has decided that leaving Hans Island looking like a souvenir shop in Ottawa just won't do. You're a Danish naval officer on this trip, and you've been handed a mission brief that reads suspiciously like a grocery list. 1. Remove Canadian flag. 2. Leave Danish flag. 3. Deliver schnapps. You step onto the rocky shore, boots crunching in ice. The Canadian flag stands there in full defiance, flapping like it knows it's about to be evicted. At its base, the infamous Canadian Club bottle squats in the snow, label frosted over but still smug about its residency. Take it down gently, your commander says, as though we're handling priceless art instead of a piece of polyester destined to be folded in a drawer. You oblige, lowering the maple leaf with ceremonial care, though you can't help smirking. In its place goes the bright red and white cross of Denmark. You plant it deep, like you're staking a claim in the middle of the moon. Verified historical fact, Danish troops regularly visited Hans Island throughout the 1980s and 1990s, swapping flags and leaving bottles of schnapps or brandy in response to Canadian whiskey drops. No bullets, no arrests, just a liquid exchange program conducted entirely above freezing point for alcohol, but well below it for humans. Weird trivia nugget. The schnapps of choice was often aquavit, a Scandinavian spirit flavored with caraway or dill, which has been around since the 15th century. In other words, Denmark brought a drink with nearly 600 years of heritage to a rock where nothing is heritage except the wind. Historians still argue whether the Danes' response was a direct diplomatic order or simply Arctic patrol crews having a laugh at Canada's expense. Some believe it was unofficial at first, then quietly tolerated once leaders realized the PR value of conflict without casualties. Others think it was a calculated move from day one liquor diplomacy as performance art. You place the schnapps bottle carefully on the same spot the whiskey stood. A glass baton in a marathon of nonsense. We should leave a note. Someone says, "So you do" on Danish letterhead, naturally, politely welcoming any Canadian who happens to drop by and suggesting they enjoy the drink. It's not so much a challenge as a neighborly wave across a very, very icy fence. The humor in it starts to sink in. Here you are, a trained officer in the Royal Danish Navy, and your combat action today is to swap flags and restock the minibar of an uninhabited rock. 3 jokes immediately right themselves. This must be the only war where both sides leave better supplies for the enemy. You've technically invaded Canada with 40% alcohol by volume. Somewhere in a defense budget, this counts as logistics. The photographer snaps a shot flag in the background, schnapps in the foreground. It's practically a tourism ad, except the destination is a place no sane tourist would choose. You're not even sure why you took your gloves off for the photo. Your fingers may never forgive you. You glance around at the landscape. Canada's Ellesmere Island is a hazy smudge in one direction. Greenland's icy cliffs in the other. Hans Island is smack in the middle, a geological middle child making both parents bring snacks to visitation day. The wind cuts through your parka and whispers, you know they're coming back, right? Back on the ship, the bottle you took from the Canadians now sits in your quarters. It's not for drinking, it's a trophy. Some future patrol will probably take it back to Ottawa and put it on a shelf, and the loop will continue. This is the slowest tennis match in history, the ball being a national flag and the court a frozen boulder. By the time you radio into headquarters, you can already picture the Canadian reaction. Someone in Ottawa will look at the latest photos, sigh, and book a trip north. The game is afoot, and the rules are simple. Always replace what you take, and always bring something to drink. One of your crewmates leans on the rail, looking out at the shrinking island. You think this'll ever get serious, he asks. You laugh, only if someone runs out of alcohol. The ship plows on, leaving a white wake through dark water. Hans Island, once again, has switched hands without a single angry shout, unless you count the wind, which is yelling at everyone equally. The schnapps bottle gleams faintly in the snow, waiting for the next act in this slow burn comedy. The year is somewhere in the late 1980s, but on Hans Island, time has no real meaning. The Rock doesn't care who's prime minister, who's in the World Cup, or how many times a flag's been swapped. It just sits there, chewing on wind. You're trudging across it again. But this time, you're here in the dead of winter, and dead feels accurate because even your eyelashes are frozen together. This is the Cold War, but colder. No Soviets, no nuclear standoffs, just Canada and Denmark circling each other like two polite snow leopards, trading bottles instead of claws. Somewhere else in the world, politicians are arguing about missiles and ideology. Up here, your greatest strategic asset is a thermos. Verified historical fact, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Canada and Denmark both maintained periodic military patrols in the Arctic, and Hans Island visits became part of those routes. Each side took turns removing the other's flag, planting their own, and leaving national liquor behind. The weird trivia nugget you discover today is that some of the early Danish patrols didn't just bring schnapps. They occasionally left messages tucked into bottles. These weren't threats. They were closer to "hope you enjoyed your visit," but in Danish, with polite flourishes. Imagine if the Cuban Missile Crisis had been handled entirely through Hallmark cards. Historians still argue whether this ongoing ritual was a harmless morale booster for Arctic troops or a subtle, drawn-out display of sovereignty. One camp calls it soft power with a hangover. Another sees it as symbolic warfare that quietly tested each nation's resolve to maintain presence in the Arctic without escalating. And there's a smaller, cheekier school of thought. This was just an elaborate way for two militaries to expense alcohol legally. Your boots slide on ice polished by decades of nothingness. You can still see faint impressions in the snow from the last flagpole. The Danes were here a week ago. The schnapps bottle they left is now half buried, label curling like an old love letter. You dig it out, wipe off the frost, and set it gently in your pack, not because you're sentimental, but because carrying it back feels like completing a very slow relay race. 3 jokes write themselves as you work. This is the only war where prisoners of war would probably be offered cocktails. If the Geneva Conventions had a clause for acceptable proof of alcohol, this place would be Exhibit A. Somewhere in NATO files, there's probably a classified report on the beverage exchange program. Your team plants the Canadian flag again. The red maple leaf pops against the white backdrop like lipstick on a snowman. You place a fresh bottle of whiskey, Crown Royal this time, because the quartermaster was feeling fancy. It sits there like a crown jewel, ready for the next takers. The ritual has become so predictable that no one even pretends it's covert anymore. Back home, journalists are starting to hear rumors about the politest war in history. You can imagine the headline, "Canada and Denmark locked in boozy border battle." The public laughs. The diplomats politely refuse to confirm. But you know the truth. It's all very real, and it's all very ridiculous. As you load back onto your transport, you take one last look at the island. The flag flaps, the whiskey gleams, and the Arctic wind roars like an audience laughing at a joke it's heard before but still finds funny. And you can't help but think, if every border dispute worked like this, the world would need a lot more distilleries. You're back on dry land, well, relatively dry, since most of it is still snow and the newspapers are having a field day. Whisky War heats up. One headline screams, which is the most misleading thing since someone called Iceland ice and Greenland green. Your patrol photos from Hans Island have made it into a Danish tabloid, where you're apparently the villain. In a Canadian paper, you're the hero, somewhere in between. You're just a cold, tired person who carried a glass bottle like it was nuclear launch codes. This is the battle of the press releases. Not a single bullet has been fired, but every newsroom from Copenhagen to Ottawa is lining up to sell the story like it's a made-for-TV drama. Reporters call it tit-for-tat and liquor diplomacy. You prefer polite trolling. Verified historical fact, by the early 2000s, Hans Island had become a recurring topic in Canadian and Danish media, with official statements framed in firm but friendly language. Both governments insisted the island was theirs, while simultaneously treating the situation with a level of humor rare in international disputes. Weird trivia nugget: in 2002, Canadian newspapers ran a story about the Whisky War, complete with photos of flags and bottles. And the Danish media responded not with outrage, but with their own coverage, poking fun at the Canadians. It was possibly the first territorial dispute to trend in both countries' lifestyle sections. Historians still argue whether media attention prolonged the whole affair or helped keep it peaceful. Some believe the publicity encouraged both sides to keep the tone light, knowing the world was watching. Others think it locked them into a cycle once you've been seen swapping booze on a rock. It's hard to suddenly show up with tanks. Your job today isn't to plant a flag, it's to stand in front of a podium. The press is hungry for quotes, and you've been told to stick to the message. That message, apparently, is we maintain our claim to Hans Island and continue to exercise our rights under international law, boring, safe, and utterly devoid of the part where you froze your toes off next to a bottle of schnapps. A journalist asks, "Did you personally remove a Danish flag?" You smile like a diplomat and say, "We routinely patrol our Arctic territories," which is technically true, even if routinely means every time the other guys beat us there. 3 jokes form in your mind, but you only say them later at the bar. The press treats us like Cold War spies, but we're more like cold weather delivery drivers. My combat loadout parka, gloves, whiskey, flag, one of these is not standard issue. If war is 90% logistics, ours is 90% liquor runs. Meanwhile, Danish officials are holding their own press conferences, showing photos of their flags proudly flying on Hans Island. They talk about sovereignty, heritage, and Arctic presence. Then, almost casually, they mention that a fine bottle of Danish schnapps was left for future visitors. It's an unspoken agreement. Now both sides play tough for the cameras, then wink in private. The public sees the rivalry. You live the running joke. One night, you're watching a Canadian talk show, and the host jokes about sending Justin Bieber to claim the island. The audience laughs, but you know deep down that if Bieber ever set foot on Hans Island, the Danes would probably send him back with a polite note and a bottle of something stronger than schnapps. And so the headlines keep coming, each one more dramatic than the last. Arctic Showdown continues sounds far better than 2 countries exchange holiday gifts on a rock. The absurdity is the point now. Both nations are in too deep to stop. Back in your quarters, you pull out the latest souvenir from the island, a Danish flag folded neatly in a drawer, next to an empty schnapps bottle. You're not sure if it's a trophy, a keepsake, or just the world's weirdest recycling program. Whatever it is, it'll be back where it came from soon enough. The helicopter blades thump overhead, and you're thinking this feels less like a military patrol and more like a school field trip if field trips required frostbite insurance. It's the early 2000s now, and someone in headquarters decided that Hans Island needed a visible, regular presence, which, in plain English, means you're here to take pictures, wave at the horizon, and swap out whatever the other guys left last time. You land on the same ugly patch of rock as always, only this time there's a twist. A group of soldiers ahead of you are posing for selfies. Yes, selfies, full Arctic gear, frozen beards, and the Danish flag in the background like they're on vacation in Copenhagen. Tourist soldiers, you mutter, because apparently the Whisky War has entered its Instagram phase. Verified historical fact, Hans Island became a routine stop for Arctic patrols from both countries. Many visits were documented in official reports and personal photos, with soldiers treating the trips as a quirky highlight rather than a tense border mission. Weird trivia nugget: some patrols allegedly left small souvenirs beyond alcohol pins, patches, even handwritten notes, turning the rock into a kind of unspoken geocache for uniformed visitors. One Canadian officer reportedly found a Danish Lego figurine holding a tiny flag. Historians still argue whether this casual, tourist-like approach diminished the seriousness of each nation's claim or actually strengthened it by proving constant. Friendly occupation? Was this sovereignty by postcard, or just military tourism with better coats? You step over to the flagpole today. The Danes have left a bottle of Aalborg Jubileum's Akvavit, standing proud in the snow like it's posing for a magazine shoot. Next to it, a laminated photo of a Danish patrol from 6 months ago, all grinning like they just won the Stanley Cup. You snap a quick picture for the inevitable PowerPoint presentation back home. Then it's your turn. Out comes the maple leaf flag, crisp and red against the ice. The old one, Danish, gets folded neatly and stashed in your pack. Next to the schnapps, you plant the Canadian flag, step back, and the photographer says, "All right." Big smile. You comply. Because nothing says strategic sovereignty like a guy grinning with windburn on his cheeks. 3 jokes float around in your frozen brain. We've accidentally created the world's coldest photo scavenger hunt. I've been on dates with less gift exchange than this border dispute. In the Arctic, proof of presence is just a selfie with better gloves. The rest of the patrol is pure sightseeing. You tramp over to the highest point, which is about as high as a 2-story house, and look out at the empty expanse of ice. Somewhere out there is Greenland. Somewhere else is Ellesmere Island, and right here is the most over-photographed rock in the Arctic. Back at the helicopter, you stow the schnapps safely. No one's drinking it. That's not the point. The point is the swap, the ritual, the absurd consistency of it all. As the rotors kick up snow, you take one last glance at the new flag, already flapping defiantly in the wind. You know the Danes will be back. They always come back. And maybe, just maybe, they'll bring another Lego figurine next time. By now, the choreography is perfect. You arrive, you see their flag, you take it down, you put yours up. You leave booze, you take theirs. It's the great flag swap routine. And if there were medals for repetition, you'd have a chest full of them. It's a crisp Arctic morning in the mid-2000s, and Hans Island greets you with its usual personality, none. The flagpole stands at the island's modest summit, its base marked by countless old drill holes from each installation. Whoever said flags unite, people never saw 2 countries competing for the same patch of rock with the enthusiasm of rival sandwich shops. Verified historical fact, over the years, the flag swapping became so predictable that it essentially turned into a long-running tradition. Each country would replace the other's flag and leave a national spirit, often documenting the handover for domestic audiences. Weird trivia nugget. At least once, a Canadian patrol reportedly found 2 Danish bottles apparently left there by 2 separate Danish crews who hadn't realized each other had already visited. Double schnapps, double bragging rights. Historians still argue whether the tradition was a harmless quirk or a subtle means of demonstrating effective occupation under international law. One school says it's just a joke, while another warns it's a very official joke. Your boots crunch toward the pole. Today, it's flying the Danish Dannebrog, snapping in the wind like it's mocking you in Old Norse. You lower it carefully, no rips, no dirt, and roll it up. Into your pack it goes, right next to the other folded trophies you'll hand back at headquarters. Out comes the Canadian maple leaf, crisp as laundry day linens. You plant it in the same metal socket. Give it a good twist and step back. It flaps immediately. The Arctic wind auditioning for its role as flag wrangler. Then comes the exchange. You set down a bottle of 40 Creek whiskey at the pole's base, lining it up like it's part of a ceremonial altar. The Danish contribution this time, Aalborg Tafelik Vavit, standing proudly in its green glass armor. You pick it up, examine the label, and tuck it into your pack like it's the spoils of war. 3 jokes melt into the cold air. If this keeps up, Hans Island will qualify for its own liquor store license. We're basically pen pals, except instead of letters, we send 40% ABV. I've seen more dramatic flag ceremonies at a kid's summer camp. You snap photos flag up, bottle down, grin wide, and then wander the perimeter just to make it look like you're doing recon. The island offers nothing new rocks, ice, and the occasional stubborn patch of moss clinging to life like a bad habit. As you circle back, the flagpole catches your eye again. It's absurd how much this one thin stick of metal has come to represent in another century. Some archaeologist might dig it up and imagine a mighty battle was fought here. And in a way, they'd be right, just not the kind they're picturing. The helicopter arrives for pickup, blades thumping, snow swirling. You sling the schnapps in its protective case, haul yourself aboard, and watch the maple leaf get smaller and smaller until it's just a speck against the ice. Somewhere in Denmark, a patrol is already planning their trip to remove it. The dance never ends. You've lost track of how many times you've stepped foot on Hans Island. At this point, it's like visiting a weird relative. You know exactly what's going to happen, but you keep showing up anyway. And now, somewhere between flights and flagpoles, the historians are starting to circle like curious gulls, picking apart the Whisky War to figure out if it's actually a war at all. You stand on the rock, looking at the latest offering, a Danish bottle of Dansk bitters, sitting upright in the snow like it's waiting for a sommelier. It's next to a laminated note with a friendly greeting, both in Danish and English, wishing you a pleasant patrol. You can't decide if you've just been politely trolled or warmly welcomed. Verified historical fact, academic papers and think pieces have indeed debated the Hans Island affair. Some label it a quasi-territorial dispute, others call it symbolic sovereignty, and a few refuse to call it a conflict at all, preferring liquor-fueled performance diplomacy. Weird trivia nugget. In 2005, a Canadian professor half-jokingly proposed that Hans Island be turned into a joint international park where visitors would be encouraged to swap national flags and leave bottles of alcohol in keeping with tradition. It never happened, but the mental image of tourists lugging whiskey and schnapps through the Arctic still makes you smile. Historians still argue over three big questions. Was this a deliberate model of nonviolent conflict resolution? Was it an unintentional PR stunt that both governments leaned into? Or was it just two stubborn neighbors who happened to be very polite drunks? You walk a slow circle around the flagpole, half listening to your teammates discuss logistics, half daydreaming about how absurd this all sounds when you try to explain it to someone who's never been here. So, there's this rock. Right, and we keep taking turns leaving booze there. Yes, on purpose. The wind cuts in with its usual commentary. You're both ridiculous. You nod in agreement. Three jokes tumble out of you as you work. This is the only battlefield where you can improve the enemy's morale by 40 proof. If Hans Island had a motto, it would be BYOB. Archaeologists in the year 3000 are going to think this was some kind of frozen tavern. Your team plants the Canadian flag again, bright against the horizon. You swap the Danish bitters for a bottle of Canadian Club because traditions must be honored. The note is folded and tucked into your pack. Someone back home will read it, probably chuckle, and put it in a file labeled Miscellaneous Arctic Absurdities. As you head back to the landing zone, you glance over your shoulder at the flag. Somewhere, in a Copenhagen office, a historian is probably citing your work today in a paper about soft territorial presence. You wonder if they'll ever mention that your gloves smelled faintly of schnapps for the entire flight back. The helicopter rises, the island shrinks, and the debate continues far below part serious policy, part running joke, all wrapped around a lump of frozen stone. It's the summer of 2005, and for once, the Arctic sun is actually making an effort to show up. You're on a Canadian patrol ship heading straight for Hans Island, and the mood is less routine swap and more political theater. This time, you're not just bringing a flag and whiskey, you're bringing a cabinet minister. And that means cameras, speeches, and the potential for your little rock feud to end up on the evening news from Halifax to Copenhagen. As you step onto the shore, the minister adjusts his parka like he's about to cut a ribbon at a shopping mall. The Danish flag is flapping behind him, bold and smug. He gives a small nod to you, and in one smooth motion, the flag comes down. The maple leaf goes up. Cameras click like machine gun fire in a war that still hasn't had a single casualty except pride. Verified historical fact. In July 2005, Canadian Defense Minister Bill Graham visited Hans Island, an event that reignited the dispute in both countries' media and political circles. The Danish government formally protested, calling it an infringement of their sovereignty. Weird trivia nugget. After Graham's visit, Danish officials staged their own high-profile trip to the island, complete with their own photographers making this the Arctic's version of a political Instagram battle, years before Instagram even existed. Historians still argue whether this 2005 flare-up was just domestic posturing or a genuine escalation. One camp says it was politicians trying to look tough on Arctic sovereignty. Another insists it was just each side capitalizing on a silly tradition for free headlines. Either way, you were there, standing in the wind, holding a whiskey bottle for the press like it was a diplomatic document. The minister poses with the new Canadian flag, smiling as if this barren rock were the crown jewel of the Arctic. Then he kneels, places a bottle of Crown Royal at the base of the pole, and pats it like a family pet somewhere in Ottawa. A communications staffer is already writing the line, "Canada reaffirms its commitment to the Arctic." 3 jokes you keep to yourself during the ceremony. We just turned a rock into a prop for political campaign photos. This is the most Canadian invasion ever polite, gift-bearing, and well-documented. If we put all this effort into ice hockey, Denmark wouldn't stand a chance. Later, on the ship, you hear the news that Denmark is not amused. Within weeks, a Danish delegation is on their way north. They'll take down the Maple Leaf, put up the Dannebrog, and probably leave a bottle of akvavit with the same care we gave our whiskey. The cycle continues, but now it has an audience. As the island fades into the distance, you know one thing for certain: Hans Island may be tiny, but it has a talent for making big waves, mostly in the press, but waves nonetheless, and you have a front row seat every time. It's 2006 and the Arctic wind hasn't learned a new trick. It's still gnawing at your ears like a bored sled dog. You're here again, but this time there's no minister, no press scrum, just a small Danish patrol quietly approaching Hans Island. You're one of them now, wearing the red and white patch on your sleeve because the roster got shuffled and you've been assigned to the other team for this rotation. The rules of the game haven't changed, but seeing it from the opposite bench is oddly refreshing. From the deck, the island looks the same as always: squat, icy, and utterly unworthy of the attention it gets. At the summit, the Canadian flag whips in the wind, its pole leaning ever so slightly like it's been through too many seasonal costume changes. Beside it, you can already make out the shape of a bottle, probably whiskey, given the brown glass. Verified historical fact: Danish Arctic patrols continued into the late 2000s with the same ritual: remove the Canadian flag, raise Denmark's, leave schnapps or brandy, and take whatever the Canadians had left. Some patrols even made a point of bringing higher quality liquor over time. A subtle escalation in the battle of generosity. Weird trivia nugget: there's a story half confirmed, half legend about a Danish crew who once left a bottle of Carlsberg beer instead of schnapps. Just to see if the Canadians would notice. They did. It was gone by the next patrol, replaced with a Canadian beer, as if the two countries had briefly switched to Pilsner protocol. Historians still argue whether these luxury upgrades in alcohol were acts of goodwill, competitive one-upmanship, or just bored crews trying to amuse themselves. There's even a tongue-in-cheek theory that the escalating quality of gifts was turning Hans Island into the world's coldest, smallest duty-free shop. You disembark. Crunching up toward the pole, the Canadian flag comes down. Folded neatly, there's a mutual unspoken rule about treating each other's flags with care. Your teammate plants the Dannebrog, giving it a satisfying shove into the frozen ground. Then comes your turn. You set down a bottle of Aalborg Jubileum's akvavit, polished and gleaming, as if it might win a beauty contest before freezing solid. 3 jokes pass between you and your crewmates as you work. We're the only patrol in history where a successful mission is measured in milliliters. This is less war and more Secret Santa with passports. If climate change melts the Arctic, Hans Island will just become a floating minibar. You pick up the Crown Royal the Canadians left. It's heavy in your hand, cold enough to frost your glove. Into the pack it goes, to be logged, stored, and maybe displayed in some office where bored civil servants will nod approvingly. On the way back to the ship, you glance at the island one last time. The new flag flutters, the akvavit gleams in the snow, and somewhere, just beyond the horizon, a Canadian crew is probably already packing their next counteroffensive. The game continues, and now you've played it from both sides. Turns out, it's just as silly no matter which flag you're carrying. It's the late 2010s now, and for the first time in decades, someone in both Ottawa and Copenhagen decides maybe it's time to talk about sharing Hans Island instead of playing Arctic Capture the Flag forever. They call it joint management discussions. But to you, it sounds like two parents negotiating custody of a rock their kids don't even want to visit. You're part of a Canadian delegation flying into Greenland for a bilateral meeting. The agenda is full of phrases like cooperative sovereignty and mutual stewardship, which are just polite ways of saying, let's stop spending gas money to swap flags on a glacier. Everyone's wearing suits. And for once, there's no bottle of whiskey in sight, at least not on the table. Verified historical fact, in the late 2010s, Canada and Denmark began formal discussions on resolving the Hans Island dispute, including the possibility of splitting the island or jointly managing it. These talks were low profile but persistent, part of a broader push for Arctic cooperation. Weird trivia nugget? At one of the early meetings, a Danish delegate reportedly joked, "We could just leave a permanent bar on the island and call it even." It wasn't written into the minutes, but the Canadian side did laugh, and someone actually drew a tiny tiki hut on the meeting map. Historians still argue whether these talks were driven by a genuine desire to end the dispute or by the growing cost of Arctic patrols in an era of tight budgets. One camp says it was about fostering Arctic unity. Another points out that both countries were starting to face bigger geopolitical challenges and didn't want to waste resources on a frozen vanity project. At the meeting, you're handed a stack of briefing notes that could bore a polar bear into hibernation. Terms like median line adjustment and resource exploitation rights fill the pages. The reality is, the only resources Hans Island offers are bragging rights and a consistent supply of frostbite anecdotes. You make your case for a cooperative solution. We've proven we can handle this peacefully for 40 years. Why not make it official? A Danish diplomat nods, replying, "Because then we'll have to find a new tradition, and none of us wants to argue about which national beer to serve." 3 jokes float into your head while the translators work. This is basically a marriage counseling session for 2 countries who never dated. The lawyers are billing more hours than soldiers have spent on the island. If we sign a treaty, we should bury a bottle of each nation's liquor under the flagpole like a time capsule. After hours of polite, overly caffeinated back and forth, you leave the room knowing the game is almost over. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. You've been part of the slowest, kindest, and weirdest conflict in modern history, and now you're watching its end take shape in legalese. Still, as you walk outside into the Greenland air, you can't help picturing the island's lonely flagpole. The wind won't care if there's a treaty. The snow won't care. But you will, and so will the next patrol that shows up just for old time's sake. You'd think after 40 years of swapping flags and bottles, the Hans Island saga would quietly fade into the archives. But no, because now Twitter's found it. One morning, you wake up to see the hashtag Whisky War trending, sandwiched between celebrity gossip and a viral video of a moose on a trampoline. It starts small. Someone posts side-by-side photos, a Canadian flag with whiskey, a Danish flag with schnapps. The caption reads, "Healthiest war ever, stay hydrated. Folks, within hours." The memes roll in, a cartoon of 2 soldiers politely offering each other drinks over a snowbank, a mock dating profile for Hans Island Small, icy, and enjoys long walks in the blizzard. Verified historical fact. In the 2010s and early 2020s, Hans Island became a lighthearted meme topic online, especially after international media revived the story. Both Canadian and Danish officials occasionally played along, making tongue-in-cheek remarks on social media. Weird trivia nugget. In 2018, the Danish military's official Twitter account posted a photo of a Hans Island patrol with the caption, "Visiting our northern neighbor brought snacks." The Canadian Armed Forces replied, "Thanks, we'll bring dessert next time." Historians still argue whether this wave of online humor helped humanize international diplomacy or trivialized it. One group says it showed the world that disputes don't have to be hostile. Another says it turned a legitimate sovereignty issue into a running joke. Then there's the third camp, the meme makers who don't care about treaties as long as they get likes. You're scrolling through the chaos, and there it is, a viral TikTok recreating the battle using stop-motion Lego figures, complete with miniature whiskey and schnapps bottles. You can't even be mad. If anything, you're impressed someone found a way to make your job both cuter and less freezing. 3 jokes you nearly tweet from your own account but don't, because you like having a career. Deployed to the front lines of the booze belt. Our enemies are well hydrated, high proof, and very polite. Finally, a war my mom can brag about at book club. The attention snowballs. International outlets start writing feel-good pieces about the Whisky War. Interviews pop up. You're suddenly explaining Arctic geopolitics to podcasters who spend more time asking about the liquor brands than the legal framework. And honestly, you don't mind. After decades of frozen toes and flagpoles, it's nice to see people smile about it, even if the internet inevitably moves on to the next shiny thing. For a moment, Hans Island is the most famous rock in the world, and it didn't need oil, gold, or a Netflix series to get there. It's 2022 and the air feels different. Not because the Arctic has suddenly warmed up, though the ice is definitely sulking, but because everyone in Ottawa and Copenhagen seems to know the game is ending. You're here not for another flag swap, but for the last one, the finale to a 40-year performance that's had more photo ops than actual tension. The plan is simple. Sign the papers, split the rock, smile for the cameras. Canada gets the western half, Denmark gets the eastern half. In other words, the most Canadian-Danish solution imaginable, half each. No fighting, and everyone goes home with a souvenir. Verified historical fact. On June 14th, 2022, Canada and Denmark officially agreed to divide Hans Island roughly in half, resolving the world's friendliest border dispute after 49 years. Weird trivia nugget. The agreement created the first land border between Canada and Europe, technically between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark via Greenland. This means geography nerds everywhere suddenly had to update their countries sharing borders trivia lists. Historians still argue whether splitting the island was always the inevitable outcome or a product of the times and era where Arctic cooperation is politically valuable. One camp says it was the only fair option. Another insists it was a symbolic gesture to show the world that even land disputes can be solved without sabers rattling. You stand on Hans Island's middle ridge, the invisible new borderline under your boots. On one side, the Canadian maple leaf flaps. On the other, the Danish Dannebrog waves back. Between them, a small table holds 2 bottles Crown Royal and Aalborg Akvavit, side by side like they're toasting the end of their decades-long relay race. The officials arrive. Handshakes happen. Someone gives a short speech about peaceful resolution while you try not to think about how many frostbitten toes it took to get here. Cameras flash. Someone uncorks the whiskey. Someone else the schnapps. And for the first time in history, the drinks are poured and shared right there on the island. 3 jokes float to the top of your mind. The world's friendliest war just got the world's friendliest border. Our battle flag is now basically a picnic blanket. In the end, we all surrendered to the liquor. As the gathering wraps up, you realize there will be no more surprise patrols, no more swapping bottles in the snow. The tradition is over, or maybe it's just officially transformed. The wind still roars across Hans Island, but now it's carrying laughter, clinking glasses, and the odd sound of a camera drone buzzing overhead somewhere. A historian is already writing the last chapter of the Whisky War, and you can't help but feel like you just stepped out of the strangest, kindest conflict in history. You're back on Hans Island one last time, not as a claimant, not as a patrol officer, but as a spectator to its new life. The paperwork is signed, the borders are set Canada's west, Denmark's east, and the only thing left is to pack up the props from a 40-year theater production. The flags stay, now on their respective halves, both fluttering in the same wind. It's strange before. The sight of the other flag meant it was time for action. Swap it, stash it, replace it. Now, you just look at it and nod, like an old rival you've retired from competing against. Verified historical fact after the 2022 agreement. Hans Island became a symbol of peaceful dispute resolution, frequently cited in diplomatic speeches as a model for international cooperation. Weird trivia nugget, a small commemorative plaque was installed on the island, engraved in English, Danish, and Greenlandic, marking the end of the Whisky War and featuring tiny carvings of a whiskey bottle and an akvavit bottle side by side. Historians still argue over the real legacy of the Whisky War. Some say it's proof that diplomacy can be civil and even funny. Others think it's just a charming footnote in Arctic history. A few insist it was never really about the island at all. It was about showing the world that borders don't have to be battlefields. You wander to the middle, where the imaginary no man's land once existed. The snow crunches under your boots, and you imagine the ghosts of all those past patrols, Canadian and Danish, standing around with their flags and bottles. Nodding in approval, you place a small offering on the ground, a half-full flask of blended whiskey, and a miniature bottle of schnapps, tied together with a bit of red and white ribbon. It's not official policy, it's just habit. 3 jokes come to mind, softer this time. This is the only war that ended with both sides drunk and friends. The peace treaty didn't need pens, it needed corkscrews. Somewhere, Hans Hendrik is still laughing. As you board the helicopter, you glance back one last time. The 2 flags dance together in the Arctic wind. The bottles at the base of each pole gleam faintly in the pale sun. The island isn't just a rock anymore, it's a story, a legend, a reminder that sometimes the best way to win is not to fight at all. The rotors spin up, snow swirls around you, and Hans Island shrinks into the horizon. The war is over, but its spirit will live on in every retelling, every chuckle over coffee, every lecture slide in an international relations class, every meme that resurfaces when the internet gets bored, and maybe, in a few decades, some bored patrol will land here, just for old time's sake, and swap a flag or two. The cold fades away now. You're no longer on a windswept ridge with 2 flags snapping above your head. You're warm, comfortable, and the sound of the Arctic wind is nothing more than a memory. The war, the politest, strangest, most good-natured war in history is done. The helicopters are gone. The ice has settled back into its quiet vigil. Breathe in slowly. The horizon is wide, calm, and empty. No more long flights for a 5-minute flag swap. No more bottles buried in the snow, waiting for the next patrol. The game is over, and everyone went home smiling. Picture the island now in the soft light of Arctic summer. The flags wave in their places, but they're not challenges anymore. They're neighbors greeting each other across a shared yard. The bottles at their bases are just tokens, reminders of a joke well played. There's no rush to change them, no need to prove anything. Let your thoughts drift over the frozen channel, the vast ice fields, and the quiet hum of the world at rest. There's no urgency here, no deadlines, just the steady rhythm of wind and water, shaping rock and snow the way they always have. You're safe. The mission is over. No one's coming to take your flag or your bottle. There are no cannons, no alarms, just the gentle whisper of peace settling in. Let it wrap around you, slow and steady, until all that's left is the calm. The island fades from view, but the story stays with you, not as a battle report, but as a bedtime tale of how the smallest disputes can become the sweetest legends.